And welcome back to Hannity. Now, while remembering former South African President Nelson Mandela over the weekend, the Reverend Jesse Jackson argued that despite Mandela's battle to end apartheid, it not only remains in South Africa, but also exists right here in the United States of America. Watch this.
And even today, while we won the apartheid battle against skin apartheid, the surface level, and political right to vote, the apartheid remains, the apartheid gaps in poverty and health care and education. We're in the middle of the end of the apartheid struggle even now.
You terrorize, you torture and provoke me. You exploit and bully my soul. You are the demon, a devil, a monster of your very own. You backstab me when I sit and work. You try to impress our neighbors for business, greed, profit, forever advertising on your self-defense karate school cookbook. Respect is what you try to sell, but everyone knows you're a big bully. Poke my eyes out when I try to sleep. Let's call Mo and Curly. Encouraging your students to do the same in a big hurry. To terrorize people of color for confidence, learning and play. What a big creep. You're driving out minorities from your workplace, neighborhood, street. Trying to act cool like you're doing good. The authority of residential zoning and real estate distribution crook, snook, took. Liberate our souls, liberate our freedom, backstab my soul, incarcerate our kingdom, deny us money, deny us freedom, backstab my soul, torture and mislead them, backstab my soul, take away our freedom. You target those who threaten your image, those who you envy, those who know enough to discredit your big belly, camouflaging the attack, cheap shots around the clock in darkness while wearing black. Bedroom terror horror show is what you really sell? Could it be? Training for human trafficking, slavery at my front door bell. Training your armies of white knights, criminalizing your opponents when they do the same. Pimpology has many colors, but the dark ones are the only ones who really pay. Exposing the truth about war, crime at every angle, and never-ending battle of exploitation. Making America the battlefield of love, giving it a bad name forever. Segregations. Romantics have gotta be insane. Psychological accusations of a mental illness worst kind. You're crazy to accuse. Every time we testify we lose. Even if we know how to rhyme. It is our dark skin that locks the bars around our souls. Incarcerated at birth, even if we steal everything from your Liberation Proclamation store, free bird. Liberate our souls, liberate our freedom, backstab my soul, incarcerate our kingdom, deny us money, deny us freedom, backstab my soul, torture and mislead them, backstab my soul, take away our freedom. Respect is what you try to sell, but everyone knows you're a big bully. Poke my eyes out when I try to sleep. Let's call Mo and Curly. Encouraging your students to do the same in a big hurry. To terrorize people of color for confidence, learning and play. What a big creep. You're driving out minorities from your workplace, neighborhood, street. Trying to act cool like you're doing good. The authority of residential zoning and real estate distribution crook, snook, took. Liberate our souls. Liberate our freedom, backstab my soul, incarcerate our kingdom, deny us money, deny us freedom, backstab my soul, torture and mislead them, backstab my soul, take away our freedom.
So there's a belief that exists that it doesn't matter if you grew up rich or poor, in a good neighborhood or a tough one, that if you worked hard, did well in school, and set your sights high, that eventually you would succeed and that we all have equal opportunity. Well, it turns out that those ideas are wrong. Everyone does not have the same opportunity. And the theory of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps simply doesn't work if you don't have boots in the first place. So the driving force that keeps me going every day at United Way is knowing that together we give boots to the bootless and we give a hand up, not a handout. Together, we help those that have the greatest needs in our community. We help them restore stability in their lives. We help them live productive lives. And we help them contribute their talent to our society. At the same time, we help the working poor find strategies to get ahead. Some think that the poor are poor because they don't try hard enough. And I can say, from seeing the work that I do every day, that some have been dealt a hand that some of us could not begin to even play, let alone win. And for many, especially people of color, the deck is already stacked against them.
As you all know, in the mid-20th century, this country decided to abolish racial segregation. We decided that it was wrong, that it was harmful, that it was immoral, and that it was unconstitutional. And beginning in the 1930s, we abolished segregation first in law schools and then in graduate schools and then in colleges. In 1954, as you all know, we abolished segregation in elementary and secondary schools. In the 1960s, we abolished segregation in everything from water fountains to buses to public accommodations of all kinds to employment. And yet, having done all this and having convinced ourselves that racial segregation was wrong and harmful and immoral and unconstitutional, we've left untouched the biggest segregation of all, and that is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated by race. I've lived in many of them. They're all racially segregated.
Basically, the argument that American apartheid makes is a simple one, but one that we haven't thought about for a while. That is that when one looks at the condition of African Americans in particular, in our large urban centers in particular, and one looks at their poverty and their concentration, what during the 1980s we tended to call the underclass, that the key structural force responsible for perpetuating and maintaining African Americans in that position has been the black ghetto and has been patterns of residential housing segregation. So the argument is that segregation is the linchpin, the undermining structural force of society that maintains blacks in the lower position that they are in society today, in all too many places.
Residential segregation is much more difficult to undo than the other segregations that I just mentioned. If we abolish segregation in buses or in water fountains or in lunch counters, the next day you can sit anywhere you want on the bus or drink from any water fountain or eat at any restaurant. But if we abolish segregation in residential neighborhoods, the next day things wouldn't be much different. It's a harder thing to undo.
Here in America, it may look like black people are everywhere, but they're not in our stores, and not in our restaurants, and not at our impeachment trials.
That's because here in America, the black people have been giving modern, state-of-the-art housing developments so far removed out in the townships, you'll never know they're there.
The reality is that de facto segregation is a myth. The residential segregation of every metropolitan area in this country was created by explicit government policy, racially designed to separate the living spaces of whites and blacks. It's as unconstitutional as water fountain segregation and any of the other segregations that I've mentioned. But we've not dealt with it. We've not addressed it. We do nothing to try to undo it. We live with it, and it's a blemish on our national character. It's a contradiction with our constitutional obligations and our principles of democracy.
It's important to study residential segregation because segregation is one of the principal mechanisms by which inequality is transmitted. And if you're segregated, that by definition means you're restricted to certain parts of the urban landscape and you can't access the full range of benefits and resources that are open to people in a market society like the United States. The most common measure of segregation is something called the index of dissimilarity, and it measures the degree to which two groups are evenly distributed across a set of geographic units. If a city is 20% black and 80% white, then an index of 0 would be complete evenness, which means every neighborhood would be 20% black and 80% white. And a score of 100 occurs when all blacks live in all black neighborhoods and all whites live in all white neighborhoods. Beginning around 1900, there was a great black migration that lasted for about 70 years, from 1900 to 1970. And African Americans move in massive numbers into the industrial cities of the Northeast, the Midwest, and the West. You see a sharp decline in the level of segregation at the state level. Basically, if you looked at a map, you'd see all the African Americans clustered in the former states of the Confederacy, and then in the course of the 20th century, black settlements spreading out to become nationwide. As blacks pour into American cities, levels of residential segregation, neighborhood-level segregation, began to rise. So one form of spatial separation basically substitutes for another form of spatial separation. Prior to the post-war period, when the Great Black Migration really took off, most white Americans thought of racism as really a Southern issue. It was bigoted sheriffs, it was Jim Crow, it was lynchings. And Northerners could think, oh, well, this is terrible, but this is not my problem. I'm not like that. Once the black population moves out of the South, race relations shifts to a national arena, and white Americans come face to face with their prejudices and their actual feelings about African Americans. The first reaction of white Americans was violence. They'd bomb, they'd firebomb, they'd lynch, they'd beat up people, they intimidated people, and culminated in the 1919 race riots, which swept northern cities and particularly hit Chicago hard. And in the wake of all the destruction of property, which is bad for business, the real estate industry adopted standards that basically institutionalized discrimination. One was discrimination in the rental and sale of housing, where people just refused to rent or sell to African Americans in white neighborhoods. The second was discrimination in mortgage lending, whereby banks would refuse to loan money to African Americans to buy homes. And finally was discrimination against black neighborhoods, where banks and other financial institutions would draw a line around the neighborhood and say, we're not going to lend to any neighborhood, any blocks within that line, and that practice was called redlining. The 1968 Fair Housing Act outlawed discrimination in the rental and sale of housing. The 1974 Equal Credit Opportunity Act outlawed discrimination in mortgage lending, discrimination against individuals based on race. And the 1977 Community Reinvestment Act outlawed discrimination against black neighborhoods so that you couldn't redline anymore. And since that time, we've seen steady declines in levels of black-white segregation.
The first one I'll mention is public housing. Now, I know you all think of public housing as a place where poor people live, single mothers with children, or young men without hope, violence, drug dealing. That's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began in this country during the Depression as a New Deal program for working families. It wasn't subsidized. It was people who had jobs. If they didn't have jobs, they weren't eligible. People who had jobs, but because there was no housing available in the Depression, the government built housing for them, and it built it everywhere on a segregated basis, frequently creating segregation in communities which hadn't previously known it. That may surprise you, but in the mid and early 20th century, many metropolitan areas were integrated. They were integrated for the simple reason that workers didn't have automobiles to get to work. And so if you had an industrial area where African Americans and immigrants from Europe and rural migrants were all working in the same industrial facilities, they had to live close enough to be able to walk to work. So you had integrated neighborhoods. The great African-American novelist, playwright, poet Langston Hughes describes in his autobiography how he grew up in an integrated Cleveland neighborhood. We don't think of downtown Cleveland as being an integrated place. He said his best friend was Polish when he went to high school. He dated a Jewish girl. This was an integrated Cleveland neighborhood, the central neighborhood of Cleveland. The Public Works Administration, one of the first New Deal agencies, demolished integrated housing there and built two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans. This is not the South. This was Cleveland, creating a pattern of segregation that helped determine the development of Cleveland's residential boundaries to this present day. And this was done all over the country. Well, the question you should ask yourself, and I asked myself when I was doing this research, is how did all these vacancies occur in the white projects and long waiting lists in the black projects? And this was because of another very powerful federal program of the Federal Housing Administration that was designed to suburbanize the entire white population into single-family homes. This was an explicit racial policy of the federal government. It's not the benign program that whites happened to take advantage of and African Americans didn't. This was an explicit program of the federal government to suburbanize the white population, to get whites out of central cities into single-family homes in the suburbs. The most famous of these, and they happened all over the country. I apologize, I can't study every city in the country, so I don't know specific names of developments here in the Columbus area, but I know there were some because this was everywhere. The most famous of these was Levittown, east of New York City. 17,000 homes. Where was Levitt going to get the capital to build 17,000 homes for which he had no buyers? The only way he could get the capital to buy the land for that development and to construct 17,000 homes was by going to the Federal Housing Administration, submitting his plans for the development, getting the Federal Housing Administration's approval for these plans, and with this approval, he could go to banks and get a loan guaranteed by the federal government to buy the land and build the development. In order to get that Federal Housing Administration guarantee, he had to make a commitment never to sell a home to an African American and to include a clause in the deed of every home in this development that prohibited resale to African Americans. This was an explicit federal requirement. The Federal Housing Administration had an underwriting manual distributed to all appraisers in the country whose responsibility it was to evaluate these proposals for developments for eligibility for federal guarantees. The underwriting manual said that no approval could be given to a development that didn't have a single racial class. It also said no development could be approved if it was near an African-American neighborhood and ran the risk of, quote, infiltration by incompatible racial elements. This was federal policy. This was not de facto segregation. These homes were very inexpensive. They were 750 square feet. They cost, in those days, $9,000 apiece, roughly $100,000 in today's money, twice national median income. Any working African American or white family could afford to buy a home like that with an FHA or VA mortgage. Whites were subsidized to buy it. African Americans prohibited by federal policy from moving to these suburbs. What's the result? The result today is that those homes that sold for $100,000 in today's money in the mid-20th century in places like Levittown, you know these suburbs all across the country. Some of you may remember a song that Pete Seeger used to sing about the little boxes on a hillside made of ticky-tacky, and they all look the same. That was a suburb south of San Francisco. Those homes sold for $100,000. Today, they sell for $400,000, $500,000. White families who bought those homes gained over the next couple of generations $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 in wealth, in equity. African Americans who were prohibited by explicit federal policy from moving into single-family homes in these suburbs created everywhere in the country continued to rent either in public housing or in the private market and gained none of that equity. The subsidy for whites was so great that they could move out of the public housing projects and into these single-family homes in the suburbs and pay less in their monthly housing charges with a VA or FHA mortgage than they were paying in rent in public housing. An income gap between African Americans and whites, about 60%. African American incomes, on average, have about 60% of white incomes. African American wealth is 10% of white wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that we have never remedied and that we've avoided remedying by adopting a myth that this never happened, that this was only an accident, that African Americans just chose not to move to suburbs or couldn't afford to,
Now, historically, affordable housing has been dumped into already poor neighborhoods and just simply contributed to both racial and class segregation. But there's a better way, and that's through distributed affordable housing. You scatter affordable housing units more widely throughout affluent suburbs to give people access to the benefits and resources that the more affluent parts of American society already enjoy. The community benefits through greater diversity at no external cost for themselves. The people benefit by having a big stepping stone that puts them on a pathway to mobility and away from dependency. Levels of class and racial segregation will be reduced, and we become a more integrated, more equal society.